Consider supporting Archaeosoup on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Link available in the video description. Thank you. Hello and welcome back to another Digging the Game. In this series we play computer games as archaeologists, and today I'm diving back into Hyrule in Zelda Breath of the Wild. We're starting today's video on the Great Plateau, and this is part 4 in fact of this series. You may recognise the Temple of Time there in the background from part 1, but this game really is the game that keeps on giving as far as the interplay between in-game archaeology, real-world archaeological theory, and also the realities of computer game design. That's why I keep on coming back, and also obviously because I simply love this game. It's magnificent. But anyway, we're going to start on the Great Plateau, and we're going to head in this direction over here. And this is going to highlight one of the curious little conceits of game design, and that is that you can have dramatic zone shifts within a few steps. So suddenly, poor Link here is freezing to death, absolutely chilled, being chilled to within an inch of his life, and we're going to have to change his clothes because otherwise he's going to freeze. So let's put on the warm doublet, shall we? There we go, that's better. Now, that's not remotely, as it were, a realistic prospect. The idea that you can step from within, I don't know, 50 meters generously, 20 to 30 meters more likely, and suddenly be in a place where you're going to freeze is quite ridiculous. But from an in-game perspective, it makes me wonder whether or not there's going to be some differences in terms of how people are living on the plateau in this cold area. Can we find evidence of people trying to survive against the cold? Well, we have here one of the Guardian robot monsters, which was frozen in the act of pulling apart someone's house here. We can see the doorway, and as we go in, plenty of firewood. Now, I don't know, is this actually firewood, or is this wood from the destruction of the house? It's hard to tell, but if we're being generous, I suppose we could say that there's plenty of firewood, because people needed it because they're in a cold part of the world. We have a little cooking pot here. If we wanted to, we could light it up and cook some food. So, okay, firewood for cooking, very necessary food. We have a korok leaf. That's an important element. In fact, I shall pick that up because we shall need that in a moment. What shall I drop? Oh, what to drop? I guess I shall drop this. There we go. Pick up the leaf. So this house, very similar in construction to the houses though that we see across other parts of Hyrule. Basically just planks. It's hard to see any evidence of chinking, as you might get, for example, in a wood cabin, perhaps in the Appalachians in the US or that kind of area, where it can get very cold at winter, and you sort of basically block the area between the planks with mud and stones and this kind of thing. It's not the same as daub or in the wattle and daub process. It's a different idea, but similar outcome, I suppose, in terms of insulation. Not much evidence of that. Maybe it's just rotted away though. Chinking does tend to disappear over time. So, okay, a little bit of evidence of people being prepared for the warm, in terms of having plenty of firewood. And here we have the official entrance to the wintry area, a gateway, which separates the Temple of Time over there from. Oh, here we are, suddenly back in the warm. You see, it's very artificial. It's very non-realistic in that sense. However, from a game design perspective, but also I'm tempted to say from an in-game culture perspective, people have prepared for entering the cold in other ways. There are spicy peppers here planted by the gate. Now clearly clearly this has been put here by the game designer very conveniently. And so I'm tempted to think that actually what's happened is that the area has been walled off here as a bit of a reminder that if you wander up this hill, you're going to suddenly find yourself freezing to death. But also as well, perhaps people with that in mind put those spicy peppers there so you could eat them and keep yourself warm as you went on a trek into the mountains. And, well, shall we go into the mountains? Let's do just that. Now we need to try and cross this river here. So let's see, what can we do? Okay, woodcutter's axe. I shall drop temporarily my leaf, pick up the axe, and chop this tree. I think I'll chop this tree as well. Drop the axe again, pick up the leaf, and we've made a bridge. Now clearly there was a bridge here already, so again people had been coming up the hill into the snowy area to get to this well, not quite a bridge I suppose, it's more like a jetty, isn't it? But clearly it's seen better days. So, oh, cold water, must be aware of the cold water, it will kill me. Ah, no, 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 no. Oh God, no, 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 no. No, no, no. I know how not to freeze to death. We could try and cross on the logs there, but just because it would be too embarrassing for me if I did freeze to death in the river. I'm going to make a little ice block and glide over here. There we go. So onto the jetty, and I picked up the leaf because that's going to be useful for blowing this boat over here. So presumably the leaf then was in the hut back there because this jetty belonged to that person in that house. Perhaps they routinely crossed this river here to get to the mountain. That's an interesting thought. Anyway, go away, shush. Let me just deal with this fella. When he explodes, he froze me. There we go. Now this river, interestingly, is called the River of the Dead. Now that is, in the real world, that would be dripping with symbolism. We've just crossed the river Styx on a barge. We've had to be very careful not to go into the river. So there's all sorts of potential connections with, in particular, for example, classical mythology there. I think it's probably in game, or in this world, it's probably more of a reference to the fact that this area is very cold and not much can live here. But as we walk along the river bank, we're looking out for, well, any potential features. Why on earth would people be crossing the river routinely from that hut? And here we come across some signs of life, signs of human action, some architecture, pillars. Now this isn't a wall, there doesn't seem to have been a complete wall because it's quite carefully dressed on all the edges there, but it's clear it's a series of pillars. Maybe they are markers leading you up into the mountain, and this is actually something that you do see in the real world. And I'm just going to eat some food because I've got very few hearts after all that swimming in the lake. An omelette, I think. Lovely. We do see in the real world is people marking out mountain trails, for example, with small piles of stones, small cairns. You see them in mountain walks in Britain, but also, for example, in the Himalayas. It's traditional to put a rock, keep on adding rocks to these things. Every single time you come across one, you add a rock, and that means that the marker will always be there. And I don't know, can we see where the architecture was leading us to? Perhaps over here. There are no more pillars, but there is a wall. Now this wall here actually is part of the wall that surrounds the entirety of the plateau that I'm on. This is actually something which I've highlighted in a previous Archaeology of Zelda Breath of the Wild video. But this wall, it goes all the way around the plateau. So here, a bit of the wall here, bit of the wall here. If you recall, this area here was flooded, an old entrance way from the ground below up to, from the gatepost town ruins up onto the plateau, and the wall continues around here, around here, around here, goes all the way around here, and eventually we end up beyond Mount Hylia where we are. So this is part of that wall that surrounds the plateau, the area that you're first in, or sorry, at the beginning of the game, that you find yourself starting out from. So was it simply leading us up to the wall? Well, possibly not. You've probably already seen that on top of this area just here, on top of this hill, is fairly obviously a structure. Oh. Go away! Is a structure. The structure is here. It is a shrine on top of the hill. So I'm tempted to think that those three pillars were marking the pathway up to this shrine on top of the hill. It would be quite obvious once you got up from the river that you can see the shrine, in fact, from that point. In fact, let's just go back to the place where you emerge from. So this is the pathway. There are the three pillars. It comes up, and when you emerge onto this area from here, you can see the shrine. So maybe that's what we're looking at there. So here we are back across the river, back where we began at the foot of the jetty, and with the ruin of the house just over there. And you can just about see the shrine that we went to in the distance. So perhaps those three pillars that are over there are markers to get up to the shrine. Perhaps they are this jetty is some sort of division, deliberate division away from that area. Who knows? But there's another way that you can head from here, and that is up this trail. It's just about identifiable as a trail. The sort of the pathway sort of dips a little bit, and there are sort of trees on either side. And as we continue, there's a reason I'm taking you up here, and that is that I suppose I'm fascinated by this whole area in terms of how it's been mitigated by culture. So we come to a rock wall. We continue up here. Again, there's sort of a bit of an identifiable trail up between these rocks over here. There is a small campsite just there, which is where there were some monsters until just before I started recording. I did sort of clear the way a little bit. Where we continue up here between these rocks, and a little bit like with those three pillars marking the way potentially to that shrine. At the top of this little trail, we have some more architecture, some more pillars reveal themselves. So again, I'm tempted to think that this is cultural mitigation. This is people a little bit like the markers that you get on mountain pathways in treacherous landscapes. These are markers in the landscape, helping people in a dangerous place to find their way. So three pillars once again, and we continue up this pathway, and we find ourselves heading towards not that shrine, but rather another set of pillars. Now these pillars are close to the sort of the wall that encircles the plateau, but they are nonetheless still those distinct pillars. 1, 2, 3 pillars. Some bare pine trees by the look of it. Some trees which have been potentially, well, maybe they're dead, but they've been left in place, maybe as landscape markers still. We continue along, and bit by bit it becomes clear that actually what we're following is a mountain path, a fairly pleasingly spiraling mountain path. This is, I do believe, Mount Hylia. So this is one of the tallest points on the map. It's certainly not the tallest, but it's one of the tallest points on the map. And we come up, spiraling as we go, and at the top we have a slightly crude, compared to the pillars below, little sort of ziggurat type thing, a little cairn, a pile of rocks with a larger rock in the middle. I really don't want to speculate too much about what this could mean. Again, in the context of sort of prehistory, I'm tempted to think that this is an old monument, in the way that perhaps, for example, in the British landscape, sometimes you'll have grand houses who own the land around, say, a prehistoric monument. They'll have little follies that they've built into the landscape, more recent, deliberately ruined structures that sort of point to that ruin. This could also just simply be almost like a surveying point. It could be a place that someone has put that rock on top so that they can, from a distance, tell how high this mountain is. It's hard to say exactly what's going on, and there's no evidence of anything underneath there. You can see where the moonlight's getting through underneath. But again, I find it interesting that this is evidence of that sort of, as I say, culturally mitigated hazardous landscape. We have pathways marked out, safe routes through an otherwise dangerous place. So either way, whether this is a ritual place that's been pointed to by markers in the landscape, or whether it's some sort of surveying block, as you sometimes get on mountains to help people see the peak from a distance, this is clearly a landscape that has been shaped and managed by society, by a civilization in that sense, and I appreciate that. It's good in-world archaeology going on. Anyway, once you're at the top of the mountain, something that's cool about this game is you can snowboard down on your shield. I wouldn't recommend doing this with all your shields though, because it does damage the shield, but I find that quite pleasing. Anyway, we're going to move on to a decidedly different part of the world. So here we are at our second location for this video, and as you can see, it's a jungle. A distinctly different vibe, most certainly. And this area actually has a slightly, in my opinion, a slightly sort of pulpy feel, in that sense of it being a stereotypical sort of archaeological location. But I'll come back to that in just a moment. First of all, I just wanted to briefly talk about map names. Map names are something that archaeologists really do rely on in the real world when it comes to identifying the history of places. And this huge map of Hyrule in Breath of the Wild is chock-a-block with map names, but in that sense references as well to previous games and an implied history, maybe even if it's like a mythological history to the whole world. The first example of this that really caught my eye, at least, was Tingle Island here. Tingle Island is named after a character called Tingle, who first appears in Zelda Wind Waker, and he's a slightly disconcerting character. He's a small man, a little chubby fella who wears a onesie, who's convinced he's a fairy and that he has magic, and he has this sort of this strange incantation, Kulu Limpa, that he shouts out. He's an odd chap, but here, with a slight misspelling of the name, he's clearly being referenced, even though he's not in this game. Maybe someone remembers this mythological character, and well, he's had an island named after him. We have a little further up the coast, Marlin Bay. Now this is a bit of a reach, but people seem to concede, broadly speaking, that Marlin might be a reference to Marin, who is a character who appears in my favourite Zelda game, actually, Zelda Link's Awakening. Marin was on an island. I won't give any more away about her nature or about the island. On an island, though, in that game, she's a character who Link, the protagonist, meets early on. So Marin, you may not agree with that. But another reference to that game, though, is Coholin The island that Link finds himself on in Link's Awakening is Coholin Island, and here we have Coholit Rock. You see, and actually the rock itself looks in its profile quite like an egg on the horizon, actually, and that's because in the game Link's Awakening, the island takes place. So the island on which the game takes place, so the island has an egg on a mountain, it really at its heart, at its center. So Coholit Rock with an egg-shaped rock on top. That's kind of cool. So lots of little references there. There's also some other ones which I appreciate. So, for example, actually where we are stood, we're in, broadly speaking, the Faron region, and then we have there the Faron Woods. And in previous Zelda games, notably, for example, Skyward Sword, the wooded area was called the Faron Woods, and even the jungle that we're in is technically still the Faron region. So perhaps the woods have become a jungle, some sort of tropical jungle over time in that region, in that area. We have the Bridge of Hylia. This is a landmark that appears notably, very notably, in Zelda Twilight Princess. It's actually a big part of the sort of the opening of that game, in terms of the menu for the game, and also actually the marketing, the trailer. So the Bridge of Hylia. To the northeast of Lake Hylia and the Bridge of Hylia, we have the Zora domain, where sort of the fish people of Hyrule live, and in their domain we have a very nice little reference to a princess from the game Zelda Ocarina of Time. Many people's favourite Zelda game, frankly many people's favourite game of all time, and that is Ruto Lake. Ruto was the princess of the Zora in that game. We also have the Ruto Precipice here as well. So clearly these people, at least apparently 10,000 years, certainly more in fact time after that, according to the in-game timeline, later, these people are in fact referencing Princess Ruto, the famous Zora. And finally, one of my favourite little references is here. This series of islands here. All of these names, Gaponga, Wes, Zaus, all this stuff is significant, but my favourite is Linebeck Island. It's a crappy little island in the middle of some wetlands with some really interesting wetland bridges connecting all these little islands together. But Linebeck is a scoundrel, an absolute scoundrel from the game, the Phantom Hourglass. And not many people like that Zelda game. They think it's a bit tedious in places, but Linebeck is an unforgettable character, completely out for himself, and apparently he has a little island named after him. So of course these name references, really they are in fact Easter eggs. They're Easter eggs for people who love the Legend of Zelda computer games, but they also act in game as a bit of a reference to perhaps the history of the land. Actually, I suppose one final one, just to the west of Hyrule Castle, in the centre of the map. Just here we have the Breach of Demise, and again, in terms of a reference, this is important. Demise was the first evil incarnation of the game's primary villain, and here we have this rocky area that looks like it's been thrust up out of the ground, and it's possibly referencing events in the game Zelda Skyward Sword, but crucially certainly the character of Demise from that game. The whole map is in that sense littered with history, with oral history, I guess, cartographic history, certainly a history that's familiar to people who play the Zelda games. And so if you are an in-world archaeologist like Dr. Calip, then perhaps these names would be significant to you when you're researching the history of this place. Anyway, back to the jungle. So yeah, the first thing that strikes me about this whole jungle area is we're moving up the river, and when you first come into this area, you have to follow the river down by the river. There's a slightly rough shod sort of stonework pathway laid out there. I say roughshod, it's quite nicely dressed though, with the patterns there on the rocks, and that's quite hazard laden. So I'm up here on the ridge instead. But as you go along the river, I love these serpentine, perhaps sort of jaguarish heads that are absolutely referencing, for example, Mayan sculpture and architectural artwork. But what they are referencing in game are in fact the monsters that we're about to bump into. Here we have a head that's fallen into the riverway here. Clearly, it was roughly where I'm standing now, and it's fallen down. That's quite cool. Quite a nice bit of in-world erosion over time. And this whole area is presumably designed from a sort of phenomenological standpoint to intimidate you as you come up the river. Perhaps people would process on their way up to Dracozu Lake, which is again just look at the map here, just north of us. So people would come up along the lake, perhaps. We have a bit of a dene here, a bit of a sort of a collapsed sort of structure that's forming a bit of a break in the river. But I think that was an original feature. But nonetheless, as they walked up this valley, they would have these stone heads on either side, reminding them perhaps of the power that they're about to visit. Maybe there was some element of reflecting on different aspects of some sort of journey as they went. That's something that we see, for example, in computer games like Skyrim. On the steps to High Hrothgar, there are little stones for reflection. And eventually, you come out into this sort of clearing just here. Once again, with a head at the entrance, and then here is the clearing. This is the lake, Dracozu Lake. Now, in the game, there is actually a reference to finding, coming to the monster's mouth, and you can see how this Dracozu Lake looks kind of like a dragon, a snake, a monster, a worm, or whatever, with a body, a snaking body, and then an open mouth at its head. But crucially, that's a double reference. Not only do you find the mouth of the monster on the map, but also within the mouth of the monster there is a fascinating sculpture just over there. Now, I'm not going to go down into the lake area because this whole area is crammed with, I think, the monsters who are being referenced in the sculpture. And I'm just going to quickly zoom in on one. There's one there. They are dangerous animals, the Lizalfos. They're sort of like alligators, or alligator people. In this instance, they have electric arrows that they're firing at me, so I don't want to get electrocuted. But perhaps this area here was inhabited by them or their ancestors. That's why they've got the Lizalfos sculptures all over the place. Or perhaps this was an area where people, humans perhaps, Hylians, came to meet with them, or dare I say even worship them, who knows, in the past. I love the blocks which have been used to sculpt this area. Unlike, for example, the Gerudo Desert example, where we saw the seven sisters in the desert, who had clearly been carved out of rock, and they were free-standing like that. This area absolutely relies on quarrying stone and bringing it to this place to create a place in a space. I also love, again, the intricate carvings that we can see. Again, very reminiscent of Mayan and other Mesoamerican cultures, the Olmec, the Aztec, for example. And these guys are determined to try and electrocute me. I'll move on. Now, at the top here, we have a new feature as well surrounding this particular bowl, which we didn't have on the river, and that is these pillars. So clearly, this is absolutely the focus of the journey. The pillars surround the lake and the monster's head, in that sense, and this is actually, for me, reminiscent of Angkor Wat, very reminiscent of that sort of sculpture. Not least also because it's surrounded by jungle. A little bit back into the jungle, we have this monster's head here, which is clearly seen better days. But here we are at the nostril of the monster. surrounded by water. Perhaps this was a pool where you'd have to come and maybe ritually purify yourself or something. Who knows? It's very much open for interpretation, but that is the whole point of me returning to Hyrule and Zelda in this series. I love how all of these architectural features can be interpreted. Anyway, back to the mouth or the lake, and we can see there's the sort of the open mouth shape of the lake just ahead of us, just there. And to our left, to the north, we have the focus of this entire space, and it is very impressive. It is truly a monstrous mouth with a claw to its right and its left. So if we just get a little bit closer, we have here one of the claws resting upon the rock. This clearly has been carved out of rock. This hasn't been a feature that they've needed to use blocks to create. So maybe actually what happened was whoever decided to make this shrine here, they saw the potential of the rock to be carved into the monster with its open mouth and its very impressive teeth, and then they dressed all of this little lake bowl with the stonework that we've already seen to sort of create this ritualized sort of space. Now I'm gonna enter here and risk being electrocuted because I want to look up at the monster's mouth. This is a very intimidating place, and if you bear in mind that people would have been walking up the river with those monsters' heads above them all the way, only to come up to this monster's mouth, it makes me wonder who would have been allowed into this area, who would have been allowed to approach the monster's mouth and then actually go through into the space behind. Now I'm actually going through the monster's mouth because, as you just saw, there is a moblin in there, a fairly tough bad guy that I don't want to be fighting when I'm trying to comment on the archaeology of an area. But this is the secret within the monster's mouth, though. So once we're inside, you can see that okay, they've done some modifications on a natural rock formation to make it a bit more like a monster's mouth and head. And here we are behind the moblin. He's gone to sleep, so we won't bother him. But these features here, these pillars, are from a much older structure. These are from the Spring of Courage. And actually, right down to these sort of fixtures, these light fixtures on the wall, on the pillars here, these sort of wings almost, with they would have had a flame in them. This sort of torches, right down to those. These are exactly like that game, but 10,000 years on. So everything's just decrepit and fallen apart. Clearly the water level's risen a bit out of control, and the pillars are toppling. So someone or some group of people decided to come to this place, this ruin of this fountain, and build around it a monster's head, or carve the rock around it into a monster's head, and then have a sort of a dressed ceremonial area around the lake with the monster's head, a shaped lake, and then all the way back along the river, back into the jungle, you have these monsters' heads approaching the focal point that is this place here, with a statue of the goddess. She's very significant in the Zelda game Skyward Sword, and actually I'll talk about her in the next video. I'll talk about her in a bit more detail in the next video. But I like this. I like that here we have people who don't necessarily even fully understand what this structure is. It's a different type of architecture, and it's absolutely nothing like what it was in its heyday. But what they've done is they've focused on it. They've augmented it with the architecture that they're familiar with, and they've drawn on the monsters around them, the Lizalfos, and the jungle aesthetic to create a sort of a resonance of respect around a monument that they had clearly come across and wanted to, I don't know, preserve or continue to revere. So there's an awful lot of potential here for thinking about people in a sort of in this world, as it were, in a sort of quasi spiritual sense. There's this prospect of a purification in the pool above. You have all this dressed stonework and the effort that would have gone into producing it, and there's the fact that all of this is focusing on a monument from time forgotten for these people, and I really appreciate that. Anyway, we're going to head south, and there's one more thing I want to show you. So here we are at Sargon Bridge. Now, this is to the south of the Dracozu River and the Dracozu Lake, where we just were, all the way through the jungle. But it takes a bit of time to get there, so I figured I'd skip that for you. But this is no less interesting. In fact, for me, it's still more interesting. In fact, from an archaeological standpoint, we have this bridge, this very solid bridge that leads to presumably into this sort of ritualized pathway that goes up to the dragon and the dragon's mouth, the dragon lake and the dragon's mouth, Dracozu River. It's all linked with this idea of the dragon, and so presumably all these blocks, very similar to those Mesoamerican, Mayan, Aztec style architecture that we saw up at the lake. These blocks line the pathway with these pillars, which clearly have seen better days, but nonetheless you can get a sense of approaching the bridge and then entering the jungle and so on. But this whole area here changes subtly because we continue along the pathway, and the framing of the path continues with these blocks. But then just over here, just off the path, we have this area, the Guchini, or I suppose Guchini Plain Barrows. Barrows in the plain of Guchini. Now these barrows are fascinating. I love them. I absolutely love that there's an area with barrows in for a start. That's a staple of prehistoric archaeology. But these barrows are of a completely different order to some of the graveyards that you see in other parts of Hyrule. These are literally mounds where the dead have been laid to rest. Each mound is seemingly revetted by a sort of a similar type of stonework to what we see on the pathway and what we see up by the lake. And it makes me wonder whether or not the lake, the Dracozu Lake and River, are actually connected to this burial ground. In fact, we have these small pillars which surround, often in a sort of a square pattern, presumably a mound that was inside that square. But then often in the middle we have these huge pillars that rise up out of presumably a grave. Presumably this little mound here in the middle is in fact, or was in fact, the burial for someone. So it makes me wonder whether or not people were processing to or from the dragon's mouth. Perhaps this burial ground, these barrows just outside the jungle, are linked to some sort of funeral rite where you begin maybe with the dead at the dragon's mouth and you bring them back to the burial ground, or maybe you process your dead along the path to the dragon and then you come back and bury them here. But these are impressive monuments. We have one in the distance there, one that I'm stood on, another one just there, another one over there in the distance. We have a couple of broken ones just over there. These barrows, which litter the Guchini Plain, really get me curious, and I just want to know more. Now here we have an opportunity for a bit of an excavation, in fact. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get out my stasis room and climb here, and Let's see. Nope, that's not right. Stop time on that, and I'm going to hit it repeatedly. And this will build up energy in this top plate and send it flying over there. There we go. So let's see what's inside this particular barrow, shall we? What's inside? A treasure chest. Oh no! I'm an antiquarian! Oh, phrenic bow. Oh, yes, please. Our inventory's full. I'll have to drop that. Drop another bow, I think. Because that bow looks quite good. Well, I've got a million of these royal bows, haven't I? I'll drop one that's not new. Drop. Open. There we go. So, yep, I've just looted a barrow. I am an antiquarian in Hyrule. But actually, even inside the barrow is quite interesting. It's not basic. It's actually quite nicely dressed inside as well. So again, I think it tells you something about the type of structure and the type of the type of effort that goes into making this structure, and therefore the type of people who are being buried here. It reminds me of there are barrows in, for example, prehistoric Britain, where it's clear that the dead were placed in the barrow, and say in Iron Age Yorkshire, the dead would be speared, presumably, obviously while they're dead, but after they've been laid to rest by multiple times, and then the barrow would be built around those spears. So you'd have this sort of porcupine of spear shafts, which would eventually rot away, but it would give you a sort of a bounded moment of dramatic focus of mourning and respect, I suppose. And then presumably as the spearheads rotted, maybe that was a time frame for you to begin to forget your pain, or maybe deal with your pain at the loss of that person. Anyway, in this instance, we have these tremendous pillars which do not rot away. They stand for all time. Well, until, of course, the wind and the rain knocks them over. Here we have a slightly bigger mound with a slightly more formal rock base. Rock masonry base at the bottom. Perhaps this person was in a different order of the social hierarchy than, say, this person down here who didn't get a pillar in the middle of the barrow. Over here we have a barrow that's not been dug into the ground, but seemingly put onto a rock outcrop. So let's have a quick look at that one. Now, there's one thing though that I should say as a good archaeologist, and that is that there's no evidence that these barrows contain human remains. In this instance, very similar again. We have this sort of square area that's been masonarily fenced off with a giant pillar in the middle. I'm presuming that then there must be people who have been laid to rest here. If only because the word barrow strongly implies that in the real world, in archaeology. So this I'm presuming is a huge graveyard, or I suppose a plain or a meadow set aside for the dead, for remembering the dead, for unavoidably highlighting the dead. And here we have another grave. And this one, rather pleasingly, has been surrounded by trees. A much smaller barrow kind of masonry fence around it, literally just surrounding the pillar, with trees surrounding that. Perhaps actually this stuff reflects maybe the wishes of the person who's been buried. Maybe this person wanted a relatively small man-made focus on the grave, and wanted to be surrounded by trees on a small mound. Potentially. And there's one more feature here that we can excavate, as it were, and that is this top plate here. Okay. So this isn't actually a barrow. This is like a a sort of little platform in front of the barrow. And actually, that's something I didn't spot as we went through here the first time. This particular barrow has the barrow with the pillar up there, but then in front of it, this little platform with two pillars on either side. This could actually be a place where people left things to perhaps share with the dead. And here we happen to have another treasure chest with a royal halberd inside it. But I shall leave that, I think, in the chest. So hopefully this has been an interesting addition to our archaeological explorations of Hyrule in Zelda Breath of the Wild. I simply couldn't have been more excited when I first came across this realm here, or this area here, which was literally reminiscent of the Salisbury Plain in southern England. A whole landscape set aside for barrow monuments to presumably remember the dead. It's pretty cool. Anyway guys, that's it for today. As ever, until next time, do take care. And next time, I think I'll go to a series of village ruins.